My name is Jennifer Hall. I'm 42 years old. I served 20 years in the United States Air Force and retired as a full-bird colonel. I've flown combat aircraft, directed crisis response units, and stood shoulder to shoulder with men and women who would die for the person next to them. But nothing, not war, not deployments, not the loneliness of command, prepared me for the battle I walked into that night. The air was thick with champagne and ego. Strings of crystal light bathed the ballroom in warmth, masking the cold intentions buried underneath every smile. I stepped through the grand double doors and immediately felt it. The tension in the air, like static before a storm. Eyes turned. Conversations stalled. And then, who let her in? My father's voice, sharp as a whip, sliced through the room. Heads pivoted toward me, his jaw clenched. The perfect host facade cracked. I hadn't seen that expression since the day I told him I was joining the Air Force. But I didn't flinch. I didn't smile. I didn't explain myself. I walked past him. There, at the center of the room, under a garish golden chandelier, sat my grandfather. His posture wasn't what it used to be. Shoulders hunched slightly, skin thinner, more fragile. But his eyes were still mine, familiar, watchful. And when they saw me, something flickered behind them. "Jenny," he said, voice breaking. "Is that you?" "Hey, Grandpa," I said softly. "I'm here." He reached for my hand, but something felt off. His grip was weak, his words slurred slightly. A full glass of red wine sat untouched in front of him. His fingers trembled every time they glanced near it. "I'm glad you came," he whispered. "They said I needed to sign a few things tonight. Nothing important, just housekeeping," they said. I crouched beside him. My instincts were screaming now. "Grandpa," I said, steady and low, "we're leaving. Now." He looked at me, confused. "What's wrong, dear?" I glanced up. Across the room, I saw men in tailored suits near the bar, lawyers, notaries. I recognized one of them from my father's estate firm. "Please," I whispered, "just trust me." He hesitated. Then, slowly, shakily, he stood. As I took his arm and turned toward the exit, I could feel the room's mood shift. Quiet, then murmurs. Chairs scuffed against the polished marble floor. My father blocked our path in 4 steps flat. His hand grabbed my forearm. "Jennifer, stop. You don't understand what you're doing." I looked at him, at the man who hadn't said a kind word to me in over a decade. My voice didn't rise. It didn't tremble. "No, you don't understand what you've already done." The silence spread like ink in water. Then, from somewhere behind me, a voice I never expected. "Let her go, Dad. Brian, my younger brother, the golden boy. The one who was supposed to take over the business, the family, the throne." He stepped beside me, eyes locked on our father. "If you touch her again, I swear—" Dad froze. Brian reached for my shoulder, steadying Grandpa on the other side. We walked out together, me, Grandpa, and the brother I thought I had lost to silence. And that's when it really began. The unraveling, the reckoning, the war they didn't see coming, because they'd underestimated the quiet daughter who never raised her voice. You probably think I walked into that ballroom with a mission. The truth is, I didn't. I almost didn't walk in at all. It had been 3 years since I'd last spoken to anyone in that room. Not since my retirement ceremony. Not since my father refused to attend, even though the Secretary of the Air Force had flown in to pin my medal. He sent flowers, with a card that read, "We already celebrated your brother's MBA. We can't fly out again." That's who my father was. Is. He built a freight logistics company from the ground up. Hall and Carter Freight. Old school, handshakes over contracts kind of man. And he always believed power passed from father to son, not to daughters in uniform. He hated that I didn't follow the family blueprint. I was supposed to go to business school, be sweet, small, and manageable. Instead, I became something he couldn't predict, couldn't control. I spent years trying to earn his respect. The medals, the commendations, the command positions, they meant nothing to him. "You're just another government cog," he once told me. "The military retires everyone eventually." But there was one person who never made me feel that way. Grandpa. He was a wipeout veteran, flew reconnaissance in Europe. He never bragged, never boasted. But he watched, always watched. And when I came home with scraped knees or stiff shoulders from basic training, he'd say, "Damn proud of you, kid. Don't let the silence fool you." So when his letter arrived, handwritten, careful cursive, no return address, I froze. "Jenny, there's going to be a party. They're calling it a retirement celebration, but I think there's more to it. If you can come, I'd like to see you. Maybe for the last time." It wasn't signed Love Grandpa, just his name, Wesley Hall. Like a formal document, like something official, like a man quietly asking for help. I booked the flight that night. Still, I almost turned around outside the venue. I sat in the car, hands clenched on the steering wheel, watching the valet circle. I wasn't scared, but I was tired. Tired of being treated like I didn't belong. What changed? I remembered something Grandpa said to me once, the week I got promoted to lieutenant colonel. "If they don't invite you to the table, Jenny, bring your own chair, and don't apologize for taking up space." So I walked in civilian clothes. No name tag, no uniform, no medals, just me. And even without any of it, I was still a colonel, still a leader, still his granddaughter. And that night, I would become something more, the one who saw what no one else did, the one who acted, and the one who refused to let silence win. We didn't walk out the front door right away, not yet. After Brian and I helped Grandpa out of the ballroom, I asked the valet to hold a car for us, something unmarked, neutral. I didn't want to cause more of a scene than we already had. And maybe deep down, I needed time to collect myself. But before we stepped outside, I looked back, just once. The chandelier above the main table still sparkled. The laughter resumed in pockets. Toast clinked in the distance. And my father, he was already telling someone I'd overreacted, probably calling me unstable, or worse, dramatic. I know that tone. I've heard it all my life. Inside, just minutes before everything unraveled, the atmosphere had been perfectly staged. That's what it felt like, staged. The guests were curated. The floral arrangements weren't nostalgic or celebratory, they were strategic. The place settings, the lighting, even the music choice, it all carried the same smell of performance. But maybe no one else noticed. That's the thing about people who've never had to read a room for danger. They assume every detail is decorative, not tactical. I had noticed. At the center table, my grandfather sat like a relic, honored on paper, but isolated in spirit. Everyone who came up to greet him seemed more interested in the folder next to his wine glass than the man himself. That folder, a sleek navy leather binder with his initials embossed on it, sat there like a loaded weapon. It was open, carefully, but clearly so. And the page inside? Signature lines. 3 of them, one for my grandfather, one for a witness, one for a notary. That notary was standing near the bar, nondescript, early 40s, looking half bored, half alert. I recognized him. He'd notarized a property sale for a fellow officer at the base 2 years ago. A small house tied up in a family dispute. I remembered the name because I remember people who move money without blinking. I made my way to Grandpa's side and took in the glass of red wine untouched in front of him. He didn't like red wine. He never had. But that wasn't the problem. He looked drowsy, more than tired. His head bobbed gently between greetings. His speech, when he finally spoke, was slightly slurred. Not enough to notice if you weren't paying attention, but I was. "Jennifer, sweetheart. They gave me something for my nerves, I think. Just something mild." I didn't ask who they were, because I already knew. I looked at Brian, across the room, chatting with a woman in a silver dress. Someone from our father's board. He wasn't paying attention, not yet. None of them were. My father stood at the other end of the room, back turned to us, laughing loudly at something the CFO said. I leaned in closer to Grandpa and whispered, "Did you take it willingly?" He looked confused. I think so. They said it would help me focus. I've been tired lately, Jenny." Tired? He'd been sharp as a tack on the phone just 2 weeks ago. He knew numbers better than anyone I'd ever met. He remembered birthdays without a calendar. And now, suddenly, he needed help focusing? Something wasn't right. I scanned the table again. No pill bottle, no label, no visible prescriptions. Just the wine, still full, and a single, half-empty water glass. Next to it sat a silver spoon, oddly placed. out of line with the rest of the cutlery, almost staged. And that's when the knot tightened in my stomach. That's when the military part of me, the one trained to spot irregularities, threats, inconsistencies, sounded the alarm. I stood. "I think we need some air," I said, casually. I placed a hand on Grandpa's shoulder. He looked at me, eyes a little duller than they should have been. But he nodded. I heard my father before I saw him. "Where are you taking him?" His voice wasn't loud, but it was hard. It cut across the space between us like a shot. "To the front," I answered without turning around. "He needs some air." "He's fine," my father insisted. "We've planned everything. He just needs to rest and finish the paperwork." I turned. "What paperwork?" His smile faltered. "Just updates, adjustments to the family trust." I raised a brow. "Since when are trust adjustments signed at retirement galas?" Silence. Guests turned their heads slightly, pretending not to listen, but listening all the same. "We'll be right back," I said firmly. 10 minutes. Dad didn't stop me, not yet, but the way his eyes followed me as I took Grandpa's arm, that wasn't concern. That was calculation. The room smelled like lilies and lies. And I was done pretending this was a party. I wasn't supposed to join the military. Not because I wasn't qualified. I was. Top 10% of my class. ROTC scholarship offers lined up before I even finished senior year. I'd always loved order, structure, clarity. Things our home lacked, despite its beautiful facade. But in my father's mind, there was a very specific future carved out for me. And it didn't involve a uniform. "A daughter," he once said, "is meant to be soft, composed. She shouldn't march like a man or shout like a sergeant." When I first told him, over dinner at our long mahogany table with polished silver and starched napkins, he put down his glass and stared. "You're not serious." I was 18. I nodded. "I am." He didn't yell. He didn't hit the table or storm off. No, my father's cruelty was quieter than that, more surgical. He simply said, "This family doesn't need soldiers. We build. We lead. We don't follow." I remember blinking, trying not to show it hurt, but it did. Every word of it. When I left for basic training, he didn't come to the airport, didn't call, and during the 12 weeks that followed, I got letters from friends, from my mother, even from Brian. But not from him. I trained harder than anyone else. I finished first in every physical drill. I studied at night until my hands cramped. I wore those boots until they bled my heels raw. I made it through. And then I made it into officer training school. And I graduated, top of my class. There's a photo from that day. I'm standing in my blue uniform, cover tucked under my arm, sun on my shoulder. And my eyes are swollen. Not because of the heat, but because he wasn't there. He never came. They called my name, and I stepped forward. I saluted. I received my insignia, and I scanned the crowd like a child. But he wasn't in any of those chairs. It should have broken me. In some ways, it almost did. But then, I saw him. Standing at the very back of the crowd, beneath a tree away from the seating section, wearing a quiet suit and a soft hat, was my grandfather. He hadn't announced he was coming. He hadn't asked for a special pass. He stood there, hands behind his back, just watching. When the crowd began to disperse, I walked straight to him. I didn't speak first. He did. "You're a Hall," he said. "And you're defending the honor of this name more than anyone else ever did." I didn't cry, not in front of him. But something in me shifted that day. Something clicked into place. He understood me. Not because he'd lived the same life, but because he respected mine. Over the years, I would earn rank, deploy overseas, brief commanding generals, run rescue missions, and negotiate policy with allies. I never stopped being the girl who stood under the tree that day. And Grandpa never stopped being the man who showed up. I sent him postcards from everywhere: Qatar, Germany, Japan. He wrote back, always in cursive, sometimes with small drawings in the margins. When I made colonel, he called the base directly, spoke to my assistant, and asked if he could leave a message. "Tell her Wesley Hall says congratulations, and that her father might be blind, but he raised a damn fine daughter." And yet, even with all that, some part of me still hoped, naively maybe, that my father would come around. But he never did. He invited me once, years ago, to Brian's engagement dinner. I wore a dress, played nice, smiled through champagne. He introduced me as my daughter who used to be in the Air Force, used to be, as if my career had been a phase, as if my service, my rank, my life's work had been some sort of youthful rebellion I'd finally grown out of. I left before dessert. The only person who walked me out was Grandpa. That's why, when I saw him tonight, slumped in his chair, dulled by whatever cocktail they'd given him, something in me cracked. They were staging a show, manipulating a man whose entire life had been built on discipline and dignity. And I couldn't let it continue, even if it meant confronting the very man who'd told me, a daughter doesn't need to come back. I was back, and I wasn't leaving without the one person who had always believed I should have never had to go. There were two things my grandfather never touched: red wine and unfinished paperwork, and yet both were in front of him that night. The glass sat on the table, filled to the halfway mark with a dry Cabernet. I knew the label. It was expensive, one of the vintages Dad liked to show off at functions. But Grandpa didn't drink red. Ever. Said it gave him headaches and reminded him of a cheap communion wine he was forced to sip during boot camp back in 1954. But there it was, resting in front of him, untouched, the rim still dry. What disturbed me more was the way his fingers hovered near it, like he'd forgotten it wasn't his drink, or that he wasn't supposed to drink at all. He looked lost in his own hands. That wasn't like him. I leaned in. "You okay, Grandpa?" He blinked at me like I'd appeared out of nowhere. Then he smiled. "Jenny, oh, it's you." The smile didn't reach his eyes. Something flickered behind them, a delay, like he was searching through static to find the right channel. "Of course it's me," I said, my tone light. "I've been standing next to you for 5 minutes." He chuckled faintly. "Sorry, dear, I've been a little foggy. They gave me something to help me relax, your father said." I didn't respond. I looked at his water glass, then back at the wine, then at the envelope resting just above his dinner plate. It was thick, cream-colored, already opened. I tilted it slightly with my finger. Inside were legal documents, typed, formatted, and bookmarked with little yellow tags. One of those tags was labeled "Sign Here." The space for the signature was empty, but only just. The line was freshly printed. The pen, a Mont Blanc, my father's, rested next to it. "What's this?" I asked. He looked at it with faint interest, like he didn't recognize the folder anymore. "Just some small changes. Your father said they were necessary. Something about updating beneficiaries." My throat tightened. "Did you read them?" His eyes narrowed, then glazed again. He said it was routine, that Brian would help walk me through it. "Brian? Of course." "Grandpa, do you want to sign that?" I asked gently. He looked at me, confused again. "Well, I suppose it doesn't matter, does it? It's just a little paper." No, it wasn't. I opened the folder completely, careful not to attract attention. The pages detailed a property transfer, his primary home, 2 investment condos, and a controlling interest in the Hall Foundation account. All marked for immediate transition to Hall & Sons Management LLC, Brian's new company, the one Dad had invested heavily in last year, the one that was bleeding money and hemorrhaging trust. None of it mentioned Grandpa's long-standing wishes, charity donations, retirement stipends for the staff that had cared for him over the decades, or the medical trust for veterans he'd helped start with his own war pension. It had been gutted, sanitized, streamlined for profit. "Grandpa," I said, trying to keep my voice even, "do you remember talking to your lawyer about this?" He gave a small shrug. "Your father said he handled it." Of course he did. The glass of wine remained untouched. I moved it slightly out of Grandpa's reach. "Do you remember the name of the pill they gave you earlier?" "No, just that it was white, round." "Do you feel dizzy?" He paused, then slowly nodded. "A little." I stood up, scanned the room. Dad wasn't nearby, thank God. But 2 of his law partners were. One of them glanced in our direction, quickly looked away. I looked back at Grandpa. His hand trembled slightly. Something was deeply wrong. This wasn't forgetfulness. This wasn't age. This was manipulation, calculated, quiet, and almost successful. If I had arrived 10 minutes later, he would have signed it. He would have signed it. And they would have had every legal document they needed to push him out of his own life. And no one, not the nurses, not the guests, not even the law, would have stopped them. Except me. I placed a hand on his shoulder. Grandpa, we're going to leave soon, okay? He looked unsure. But the dinner? Doesn't matter, I whispered. What matters is you're safe. He reached up slowly and touched my hand. His skin was cool, papery thin, but still steady. I always knew you were watching, he said softly. Even when no one else was, I nodded. I still am. I wasn't the kind of person to jump to conclusions. Military training drills into you the importance of intel, of checking facts, scanning terrain, confirming before acting. But sometimes, all the signs are there. You just need to trust your gut before it's too late. The first red flag had come a few months ago, long before the retirement gala, long before the untouched glass of wine, long before the paperwork with signature tabs. It was during one of my rare visits back home. I'd come to drop off a package, some old photos Grandpa had asked for, the ones he kept in the drawer labeled Korea 1957. Dad hadn't been home, Brian either. I didn't expect them to be. But as I pulled up to the old house on Winterberry Lane, I noticed Mrs. Carmichael, our next-door neighbor, standing by her mailbox. She looked over, hesitated, then walked across the lawn toward me. I hadn't seen her in over a decade. "Jenny?" she asked, as if checking to make sure I was real. "It is you, isn't it?" I nodded, smiling. "Hi, Mrs. Carmichael. You look well." She didn't return the smile. Her eyes darted behind me, toward the Hall house. "Your grandfather," she said, her voice hushed. "Is he okay?" The question caught me off guard. I think so. I haven't seen him in person since last fall, but we talk every now and then." She looked even more uneasy. Her hands twisted around each other. "I don't want to cause trouble, but I noticed something strange a few weeks ago. He was moved out of the main house, quickly, like overnight." I frowned. "Moved?" She nodded. "One day he was there, gardening like usual. Next day, moving trucks. And then, nothing. No more morning walks. No more Sunday newspapers on the porch. Just gone." I felt a chill, but tried to keep my tone light. "Maybe Dad set him up with an apartment, downsizing." Her lips pursed. "That's not what it looked like. He didn't seem happy about it." Before I could ask more, she dropped her voice even lower. "And there was this nurse, younger gal, real sweet. She used to bring him his groceries, help him with meds. She came crying to my porch one evening. Said she got fired for asking too many questions," she said. I straightened. "What kind of questions?" Mrs. Carmichael shook her head. "Didn't say exactly, just that something felt off with the medication schedule, and that your dad kept overriding her care reports." "She give you her name?" She paused. Erin Langston, I think. Auburn hair. Wore those soft blue scrubs with daisies. You'd know her if you saw her." I stored the name like a classified code in my head. Erin Langston. Fired for doing her job. I had thanked Mrs. Carmichael and left, trying to convince myself she was just mistaken, or reading too much into a bad day. But deep down, I had known better. Then, a week later, a padded envelope had arrived in my post office box. No return address, but with familiar handwriting. Inside, a letter from Grandpa. Just 4 lines. "Jenny, things are changing quickly. I don't always understand the papers they give me. I miss our talks. Grandpa." Attached was a copy of a power of attorney form, unsigned, but filled out, naming Dad as sole agent for all medical and financial decisions. I remember staring at it in my car, parked outside base housing, heart pounding in my ears. That's when the pieces started clicking. Dad didn't want me to visit. Didn't tell me about the gala. Didn't tell me about Grandpa moving. And Brian, he'd been unusually quiet lately on social media. No more flashy posts about Hall & Sons. No more smiling selfies with investors. The silence was louder than any siren. I had thought about flying back then, about showing up unannounced, but I was midway through a classified project. I had no formal legal standing, yet, and part of me still wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, I was wrong. But I wasn't. Now at the gala, seeing Grandpa's blank stare, the envelope on the table, the unspoken pressure of everyone watching, it all connected. The sudden move, the fired nurse, the hush around the power of attorney, the rush to sign new papers. It wasn't paranoia, it was a pattern. A quiet, systematic push to isolate, confuse, and legally strip a man of everything he'd built, before he even realized it was happening. And tonight Tonight was the final move, unless I made one first. I stood up from the table, my hand firmly around Grandpa's shoulder. He still looked confused, but I could feel the slight pressure of his fingers wrapping around mine. He was aware enough to know something wasn't right, and he trusted me. That was enough. We took one step away from the table. Then I heard the voice I'd grown up flinching from. "Where do you think you're going?" Dad's voice cracked through the murmur of wine glasses and small talk like a whip across concrete. He was coming toward us fast, tie slightly loosened, but posture straight and chest puffed as if he still owned the room. His steps echoed across the marble floor of the event hall. People turned their heads. I didn't stop. "Jennifer," he said again, now just feet away. "Sit down." I didn't. He reached forward and grabbed my shoulder, tightly, fingers pressing into muscle through my uniform coat. "What do you think you're doing?" he hissed. "Are you trying to ruin everything? This is his party. This is my night." I turned to face him fully. His face was red, angry, but beneath it, just for a second, I saw fear. I stepped closer, my grip on Grandpa steady. "Let go of me." "You've always been like this," he snapped, his fingers tightening. Defiant, ungrateful. "You don't belong here. You never did." I didn't flinch. "Let go of me, Dad." "Don't call me that like you mean it." The room went quiet. All eyes turned toward us. I spoke calmly, but my voice was steel. "You've pushed him around long enough. That ends now." Dad's hand stayed on my coat, but his knuckles were whitening. "You think just because you wear that uniform you can bark orders at me? You're not in charge here, Jennifer." Grandpa's breathing grew unsteady. He whispered, "Jenny, maybe we should just—" "No," I said, not breaking eye contact with Dad. "You're not signing anything. You're not staying here. Not one more minute." Dad's eyes darkened. "You think you're rescuing him? He's an old man. He needs care, real care, not whatever drama you're bringing." "Real care," I shot back. "Like the care that got Aaron fired, or the pills he can't even name, or moving him out of his house in the middle of the night." Dad flinched. He hadn't expected me to know. That's when I felt it, his grip slipping. For the first time in years, I saw him hesitate. "You don't know what you're talking about," he muttered. I lowered my voice. "No, I do. I've read the drafts, the transfer agreements, the revocation of his living trust. You were going to let him sign tonight, after drugging him with something that blurred his memory just long enough." Gasps spread across the room. "Shut up," he hissed. "You think anyone here cares what you think? You're nothing but a washed-up soldier who hides behind rank." I stared at him, unmoved. "A washed-up soldier who knows the law better than you think. Grandpa is still mentally competent, and if you lay one more finger on him, or me, I'll have half the JAG Corps reviewing everything you've done with his finances." That's when I heard the voice I hadn't expected. "Dad." We both turned. Brian, standing at the edge of the dance floor in a black blazer and forced smile. "Stop," Brian said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. "Just stop." Dad's mouth opened, then closed. "Brian," he started. She's right," Brian said, walking closer. "This whole thing, it's gone too far. You promised it would be clean, legal, quiet." He looked at me. For once, his expression was almost human, almost sorry. "I didn't know it would come to this." Dad turned on him. "You little traitor. After all, Brian stepped between us. "Let her take him," he said. For a long second, no one moved. Then Dad lowered his hand. His face sagged, all fire gone, but it wasn't surrender, it was calculation. "You think this is over?" he muttered. "No," I replied. "I think it's finally beginning." I tightened my grip on Grandpa's arm. His hand squeezed back, a little firmer this time, and we walked out, together. I helped Grandpa down the marble steps of the Gala hall. His gait was slow but steady, hand trembling in mine. The limo driver, probably hired for appearances, stood frozen near the door, unsure whether to open it or wait for orders from Dad. I didn't wait. "Open it," I said. Not an order, a statement. The driver obeyed. I was guiding Grandpa inside when I heard the shuffle of footsteps behind me. "Jenny, wait." I turned. Brian. The polished blazer. That overconfident Wall Street walk. The golden sun. He looked tired, like something inside him had cracked wide open. I didn't speak. Not yet. Let him make the first move. He glanced back toward the glass doors, where Dad stood frozen inside, hand on the table, surrounded by guests who didn't know whether to stay or flee. I didn't know it would go this far, Brian said, eyes down. Didn't you? I asked. You were in the meetings. You knew about the papers. He nodded slowly. I thought it was just restructuring. You know how Dad talks. He made it sound like estate planning. Then why did Erin lose her job? His eyes widened. I could tell he hadn't known that part. She was asking questions, I said. He silenced her. The nurse before her? Same thing. Brian ran a hand through his hair, suddenly unsure of himself. The way little brothers look when they realize they're in over their heads. Why didn't you say anything? I asked, quieter now. When you saw him slide the papers in front of Grandpa tonight. When you saw how dazed he was. He swallowed. I wanted to believe it wasn't that bad. That Dad still knew what he was doing. I nodded. He does. That's the problem. Brian looked up at me. I have the audio. I froze. What? He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The last meeting, the one yesterday. I hit record. Dad didn't know. He said, he won't remember it anyway. Just get him to sign. I'll handle Jenny if she shows up. My jaw clenched. Brian kept talking. I didn't know what to do with it. I kept thinking, maybe I was overreacting. But when I saw you walk in, when I saw him, Grandpa, just sitting there, looking lost, and the pen already uncapped. He trailed off. I studied him. For the first time in years, he looked like a scared kid, not the smug executive Dad had molded. So what now? I asked. He glanced at the limo, at Grandpa inside, resting his head back against the leather seat. Then, back at the entrance, where Dad now stood alone, like a general whose army had fled. I already sent it to my lawyer, Brian said. If he tries anything, I'll go to the police. You'd testify? I asked, careful. He nodded. Yeah. That's when it hit me. Dad didn't step down because of me. He stepped down because of Brian, his heir, his mirror, his favorite, and now his greatest threat. Brian turned to leave, then stopped. You were right, you know, about the nurse, about everything. I folded my arms, watching him. He took a breath. I kept waiting for him to change, for him to treat me like a man, not a tool. But tonight, he looked at me the same way he looked at you all those years. I didn't say anything. I'm sorry, he added. That one landed, not because I needed an apology, but because I didn't expect it. I nodded once. That was all I had left for him. Brian walked away, shoulders heavy but taller somehow. Maybe regret does that, adds weight but also shape. I got into the limo. Grandpa's eyes fluttered open. Did I ruin your evening? He murmured. I smiled, pressing his hand. No, Grandpa, you saved it. We pulled away from the Gala, leaving the lights behind. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like a soldier. I felt like someone who had finally come home. The drive to the VA clinic felt longer than it was. Grandpa dozed in the back seat, but it wasn't a restful sleep. He twitched every few minutes, murmuring things I couldn't make out. I kept glancing at him through the mirror, just to make sure he was still breathing. The moment we arrived, I flashed my military ID and got him into a room. I didn't care if it was after hours. I didn't care about the front desk's look of disapproval. I only cared that the nurse who wheeled him in called the doctor immediately. The physician was a middle-aged army vet with sharp eyes and no time for pleasantries. He ran blood work quickly, then came back 30 minutes later with a tablet in one hand and a very tight jaw. There's lorazepam in his system, he said flatly. High dose. My stomach dropped. How high? I asked. High enough to sedate a man his size, and dangerously so, given his age and blood pressure. Grandpa stirred slightly on the bed, his breathing still uneven. The doctor pulled up a chair beside me. Do you know when he might have taken it? I shook my head. He didn't mention any prescription, but someone at the party said it was just to help him relax. No one confirmed the name. The doctor's eyebrows rose. Was alcohol involved? He had a glass in front of him, I said. Didn't touch it. Good, he said. Because one more drink, and with this much lorazepam, you wouldn't be having this conversation. Not with him anyway. I stared at Grandpa's hands, veins pale and thin, the same hands that once held mine when I cried after basic. The same hands that built our treehouse, plank by plank. He's lucky, the doctor added. No, I said softly. He trusted me. The doctor leaned back. You a medic? Colonel, Air Force, retired. He gave a small nod. Then you know what lorazepam does. Yeah, I replied. It doesn't just calm someone, it erases them. Temporarily, he clarified. But at this dosage and his age, we're towing the line of permanent impairment. Cognitive degradation, confusion, memory gaps. This wasn't a mistake. No, it wasn't. It was a setup. A setup that only needed one more drink, one more gentle push, and the signature on that blank line would have held up in court. I leaned forward. Will he recover? He's stable now, the doctor said. But he needs time, observation, no more sedatives, no alcohol. And someone he trusts watching him closely. I nodded. He'll have that. The doctor stood up. I'll file a tox report, but if you're planning legal action, you'll need to request a copy formally. Chain of custody, all that. Understood, I said. I'll handle it. After he left, I pulled a chair closer to Grandpa's bed and sat in silence for a long time. He was breathing easier now. His face looked less flushed. I couldn't stop thinking about the glass of wine, how close it had been to his lips, how my father had been watching, waiting, not angry when he didn't drink, just patient, like a man waiting for a weather pattern to shift in his favor. This wasn't just about control, it was about timing, because tonight wasn't random, it was chosen. Grandpa's retirement party, a room full of notarized documents, witnesses, lawyers, all prepped for one final act. And it would have worked, if I hadn't shown up, if Brian hadn't cracked, if Grandpa had taken just one sip. My hands curled into fists in my lap. There's a kind of anger that doesn't scream. It just sits in your chest, cold and precise. I reached for Grandpa's hand again. He stirred, eyes fluttering open. Jenny, he whispered. I'm here. His eyes were glassy, but clearer than before. Did I miss the toast? I almost laughed. Almost. No, I said, brushing his hair gently from his forehead. You made the right toast, by not raising your glass at all. His lips twitched. I'm sorry, I should have seen it. No, I said again, this time more firmly. He fooled everyone, Grandpa, but not anymore. I sat with him until dawn. The light in the room changed slowly, from pale blue to soft amber. One more hour and everything would have been different. But sometimes, 1 hour is enough to save a life. The morning after Grandpa was stabilized, I sat in a VA cafeteria with a black coffee in one hand and my old JAG contact on speakerphone. Colonel Hall, came the familiar voice of Lauren DeWitt, now a partner at a private legal firm in D.C. Didn't expect to hear from you again, especially not with that tone. I told her everything, straight, without emotion. That's how we were trained. I need a civil investigation started, I said. Fast, quiet, focused on elder financial manipulation and unlawful transfer of medical power of attorney. There was a short silence. I'm sending you a secure upload link, she replied. Dump everything you've got, documents, photos, statements. I'll bring in a probate specialist. After I hung up, I glanced down at the manila folder I'd retrieved from Grandpa's suitcase, one he'd packed himself before the party, even though he hadn't known I was coming. Inside were documents he'd been asked to sign in the past year. Some had his signature, others had only his printed name, but none of them looked right. I scanned one. Transfer of residential title to executor, Daniel Hall. Another, designation of full medical authority, Daniel Hall. I frowned. The notary stamp was faded. The witness line was blank on one. On another, the signature didn't even match his usual loop on the H in Hall. I pulled up scans of old tax returns, ones he'd filed himself, back when I helped him transition to e-filing. I compared the signatures side by side. They weren't the same. One had a flat slant, no natural curve. Another was too neat, too deliberate. I'd seen this kind of forgery before, not in a courtroom, but in a base investigation in Okinawa. An enlisted man forging medical leave forms. It was always the same mistake. Thinking a signature is just handwriting. It's not. It's muscle memory, and my grandfather's signature had never looked like these. I photographed every questionable document, time-stamped them, and emailed them to Lauren. By the afternoon, she called back. Jennifer, she said, this is bigger than a dispute over a will. I know. From what I can tell, there's been a systematic attempt to isolate your grandfather, alter medical authority, and redirect property into your father's name. I suspected that much. We'll file for a temporary freeze on asset transfers immediately. I'll also petition to revoke Daniel Hall's medical POA on grounds of coercion. I hung up and exhaled. Once. That was all I allowed myself. Then I drove back to the house my grandfather had been forced to leave months ago. It was still vacant. I had the spare key. He'd given it to me years ago, just in case. Inside, it smelled faintly of cedar and age. His books were still stacked neatly. The photo frames dusted, but untouched. It wasn't abandonment. It was eviction masked as downsizing. In the bedroom closet, I found an old lockbox. Inside were dozens of letters, notes from the VA, and a handwritten list titled, People I Still Trust. There were only 2 names, mine, and the name of a nurse I didn't recognize, Carla Mendez. The name tugged at something. I dug into my phone and found the list of former caregivers I'd compiled from my last visit. Yes, Carla. She was the one who left the job without explanation 3 months ago. I made a few calls, tracked her through a mutual VA contact, finally reached her on her lunch break. Ms. Mendez, I said, my name is Jennifer Hall. You were once assigned to my grandfather, Edwin Hall? There was a pause, then a shaky exhale. I was, she said, but I wasn't allowed to say goodbye. Can you meet? Only if it's somewhere safe. That answer told me everything I needed to know. Before I left the house, I opened Grandpa's piano bench. Inside was the sheet music I'd once played, the one my father called a waste of time. I slipped it into my coat pocket. That night, I met Carla at a diner in a neighboring town. She brought a folder, unofficial records, notes she wasn't supposed to keep. I knew something was wrong, she said. But when I asked too many questions, your father said he'd report me for inappropriate conduct. I resigned the next day. She handed me a copy of a medication chart, highlighted, circled, lorazepam listed as routine, but it hadn't been prescribed by any VA doctor. I tried to contact Adult Protective Services, she added, but your father was always one step ahead. Not anymore. I left the diner with a folder full of proof, a witness willing to testify, and a reason to make this very public, very soon. This wasn't just a legal battle. It was war. And I knew how to win one. The next morning, I sat in my car outside Lauren's office, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I'd been a colonel. I'd led complex operations across 3 continents. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepares you to unravel betrayal wrapped in family. Inside, Lauren had gathered 2 other attorneys, one specializing in probate law, the other in forensic accounting. On the screen behind her desk were financial charts, timelines, and property maps. She got right to the point. Jennifer, based on what we've found, your father has set up 3 limited liability companies in Delaware, classic shell structure. Each LLC is tied to a different address, but all managed under a trust where he is the sole executor. She clicked to a new slide. Over the past 9 months, assets totaling approximately $2.4 million were transferred. Real estate, investment accounts, even personal belongings like your grandfather's antique firearms and a vintage piano collection. I leaned forward. And Grandpa doesn't recall approving any of this? Lauren shook her head. We've cross-checked signatures. Some were notarized by a man who's currently suspended for ethics violations. Others appeared digitally forged, likely scanned from old forms with signatures spliced in. Forgery and elder financial abuse, I whispered. Lauren nodded. We're filing motions in probate court to freeze the assets, but there's more. The real estate was transferred under what's called a quick claim deed, legally questionable without full disclosure. One of the properties, your grandfather's lakeside cabin, was sold 2 weeks ago. The payment was routed through a chain of accounts and ended up under one of the shell LLCs. That money is now in a holding firm in the Cayman Islands. I swallowed the lump in my throat. He didn't just take the house, he tried to erase a piece of Grandpa's history. And the worst part? Lauren clicked again. His attorney, Samuel Ruddick, was formally disciplined 2 years ago for ethical misconduct in estate cases. Your father knew exactly who he hired. Everything began aligning. The private nurses being replaced, The medical power of attorney shifted. The Gala. It wasn't just about silencing Grandpa. It was about erasing him. I exhaled slowly. What's our legal move? We file an injunction. Seek a temporary conservatorship with you as the guardian. Demand full accounting and court supervision. And we bring criminal charges. My phone buzzed. A message from Carla. He's asking for you. He remembers the lake today. That lake cabin. Grandpa used to take me fishing there every spring when I was a kid. It was our safe place. Our secret away from the world. He remembered. Lauren, I said, voice steady. I want everything back. Every cent. Every square inch. She nodded. We're with you. I stood up. Then let's start. As I walked out, I wasn't just a granddaughter anymore. I was his shield. I sat for a moment longer in the hallway before heading to my car. The law office behind me buzzed with quiet efficiency, but in my chest, it was chaos. Rage barely tamed by duty. My father had played the long game. Years of emotional erosion, quietly isolating Grandpa, surrounding him with people loyal only to him. The system was never built to protect the silent, only the loud and connected. But I had learned something in the Air Force. Intelligence isn't just about what you gather, it's about what you prove. And this time, I had proof. Lauren followed me to the elevator. Jennifer, she said, her voice softer now. This is going to be a war. Your father will fight. He has resources, reputation. He may even try to paint you as unstable. Are you ready for that? I met her eyes. He's underestimated me my whole life. Let him try one more time. She smiled, not out of comfort, but recognition. Then let's draft the first motion. Later that evening, I sat beside Grandpa in the veteran clinic's garden courtyard. The sun was low, casting long amber shadows across the stones. He looked over at me and patted my hand. Your father. He wasn't always like this, he murmured. I didn't respond right away. I know, Grandpa, I said finally, but whatever he's become, I won't let him take any more. He looked at me, eyes wet but proud. You've always had your grandmother's fire. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about restoration. The next morning, I drove to the lakeside cabin, not out of nostalgia, but to document the damage. It had been gutted. Family photos were gone. The hand-carved rocking chair missing. Even the old fishing rods we'd labeled with duct tape initials had vanished. What remained was a shell, soulless, sanitized. I took photographs, not just for legal evidence, but because I refused to let memory be wiped so easily. Grandpa may have forgotten for a time, but I hadn't. And now, with every tool I'd gained from military law, discipline, and decades of being ignored, I would fight not to punish, but to preserve what mattered. I didn't expect Brian to speak that evening. Not after years of silence. Not after standing beside our father at every family dinner while I was stationed overseas, sitting alone with a metal tray and memories of a family that barely mentioned me. But something had shifted in his eyes after the gala. We were in the hallway outside the examination room at the VA clinic. Grandpa was resting inside. His pulse had stabilized, for now. Brian leaned against the wall, hands in his pockets like he was hiding something, or maybe protecting something. His voice dropped so low, I had to step closer. Do you remember the summer before Grandpa sold the lake house? I did. It had been sudden. Grandpa had always said he'd die fishing from that dock. Then one day, everything was boxed up. The place sold in less than a month. Brian looked at me and blinked a few times, then swallowed hard. I walked in on Dad and Grandpa in the study one night. I wasn't supposed to be home yet from college, but my internship ended early. They didn't hear me, he paused. His knuckles whitened against his jeans. Then he continued, voice barely audible. Dad had this folder open on the table. It had documents in it, deeds, power of attorney papers, even a healthcare proxy. And Grandpa was just staring, lost. I didn't interrupt. I waited. Brian needed this to come out on his own time. Dad kept repeating lines, like rehearsing a script. It's just temporary. This lets me handle bills while you relax. You'll still be in charge. He wasn't asking Grandpa to sign. He was training him to do it later. That word, training. It sent a chill up my spine. I asked softly, did Grandpa understand? Brian shook his head. He thought it was a favor. Dad made it sound like it was just some financial housekeeping. Said he'd take the stress off. And I didn't say anything. He looked up at me, and I saw it in his eyes, regret laced with shame. I told myself it wasn't my business. That maybe Dad had a plan, that maybe he'd do right by him. But then he sold the lake house, started changing Grandpa's doctors, stopped inviting his old friends over. And every time I asked about it, he'd say, "Don't worry, you'll understand when you have a family of your own." I didn't flinch. I could have. I had every right to be angry with him for letting it go on, for not calling me sooner, for being the good son while I was discarded. But I also knew what it was like to grow up under that roof. So I just said, "You saw something wrong, and you're speaking up now. That counts." Brian's shoulders sagged. He wasn't looking for forgiveness, but maybe for the first time, he wasn't afraid of the consequences. He muttered, "I started recording phone calls when I got suspicious. I didn't know what I'd find, but I knew something didn't feel right." That explained his intervention at the Gala. He'd brought a thumb drive to the hospital. Hours later, I listened to a call between Dad and his lawyer, casually planning Grandpa's mental fatigue strategy. They used words like optics and contingency, as if Grandpa were a merger to finalize. Brian looked at me as I clicked pause on the recording. "I'm not like him," he whispered. I replied without hesitation. "I know." He gave a bitter smile. "You're not saying that just to make me feel better?" "No," I said. "I'm saying it because you're doing what's right. And you're doing it when it still matters." He nodded, blinking away moisture in his eyes. For a second, we were just kids again, two siblings sitting under a blanket fort, whispering secrets and fears. Only this time, the monsters weren't imaginary. This time, we were choosing to fight them together. He looked me in the eye, full of rage, and said we were no longer his children. But I didn't flinch, neither did Brian. After weeks of investigation, witness statements, and forensic document reviews, it was official. The district attorney's office had filed charges: financial exploitation of an elderly person, unlawful influence, and obstruction of medical care. 3 felonies, 2 misdemeanors, and public disgrace. It wasn't the military trial he would have feared. It was worse. It was civilian, local, public, humiliating. The headline read, "Respected developer accused of defrauding his own father." At the arraignment, I sat quietly behind Grandpa, who was wheeled in by a nurse from the Veterans Center. He held my hand the entire time. His grip was weak, but his presence was unshaken. Brian showed up too. He didn't speak, but he wore the same tie our father had gifted him years ago, maybe as a quiet act of reclamation. A silent way to say, "This is mine now, not yours." After court, we waited outside. It was quiet. Then the door opened and our father stepped out. His eyes darted around, looking for a friendly face in the crowd. There were none, just reporters, and us. He walked past us as if we didn't exist. But then, suddenly, he turned. His voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to slice air. "You think you've won, don't you?" I didn't respond. He stepped closer to Brian. "You were supposed to take over. I trusted you." Brian's lips parted, but he didn't speak. Then Dad said the words that would echo in my mind for days. "You're not my son anymore." He turned to me next. "And you, whatever uniform you wear, whatever medals you've earned, you've always been the same. Ungrateful, defiant." I should have felt angry, but all I felt was pity. "You always talked about legacy," I said quietly. "Maybe this is it." He scoffed, face flushed with humiliation, and left. The silence that followed was heavier than anything I'd carried in combat. But it was also freeing. Brian exhaled first. We both stood there for a moment, just 2 siblings, no longer tethered to the image of a man we tried too long to please. Later that evening, Grandpa asked about the hearing. "I heard he didn't plead guilty," he said softly, eyes staring at nothing in particular. "No, Grandpa, he didn't." He nodded once. "He won't. He never could admit when he was wrong." Then he turned to Brian. "But you did good, son." Brian blinked fast, trying to hide the water in his eyes. That night, Brian stayed longer than usual. We ate soup in the kitchen while Grandpa dozed off in his chair. Brian looked different, not like a boy haunted by his father's shadow, but like a man who had finally stepped out of it. It didn't end there. 2 weeks later, I received a letter, unsigned, typed in all caps. It read like a threat, but I knew who sent it. He was lashing out from a place of fear, not power. The charges were real. The investigation was ongoing. His legacy, the thing he'd sacrificed everything to control, was crumbling. Brian and I didn't talk much growing up. We weren't enemies, just passengers in the same broken ship. But now, we were building something stronger, honest. We started visiting Grandpa together. We brought him meals, we laughed over old photos, and we learned more about him in those few weeks than we had in years. One afternoon, Grandpa asked, "Do you think he ever loved me truly?" I didn't know what to say, but Brian did. "He loved what he could get from you, not who you were. That's what Jennifer saved." And I realized redemption wasn't always for the guilty. Sometimes it was for the ones who stepped away from silence. I guided him into the living room, where we sat for the first time in years, not as soldier and elder, but as equals. The air inside the house no longer smelled of stale manipulation. It smelled like warmth, old books, lemon oil on polished wood, and faint lavender drifting through window cracks. I watched my grandfather's eyes sweep the room, lingering on every photo, every shelf, every artifact that once belonged to him but had for a time been out of his reach. The first thing I did was change the locks. The second, I changed the staff. A new nurse arrived the following morning, a woman in her 50s with a military spouse, steady hands, and the kind of compassion you can't teach. Grandpa liked her instantly, so did I. Together, we reviewed his medical records, financial documents, and old correspondence. It was painstaking work, but necessary. With the help of my lawyer, someone I knew from my JAG days, we began proceedings to reassert Grandpa's rights. It wasn't just technical, it was deeply emotional. One afternoon, I found Grandpa in his old leather chair by the fireplace, holding a photo of me in uniform, my commissioning ceremony. He didn't say anything at first, just stared. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice uneven, "for not standing up, for letting your father talk me out of things I knew were wrong." His hand trembled slightly as he put the photo down. He convinced me I was old, confused, a burden. "You were never a burden," I said, "just alone, and I know what that feels like." His eyes met mine, watery but clear. "You shouldn't have had to be the one to fix this." "Maybe not," I whispered, "but I wanted to." Each morning brought routine, breakfast at 7, walk through the garden by 8, reading or music by 10. I'd see his expression soften a little more each day. He started asking about my time in the Air Force, not out of politeness, but genuine interest. "You always led from the front," he said one morning, watching me balance a tray of tea and documents. Even when no one followed, I smiled. "Well, someone finally did." "Brian," Grandpa nodded. "I underestimated him. I underestimated you both." As we rebuilt his estate, he grew lighter, not physically, his gait was still slow, and he had days when the world spun too fast, but emotionally. I began noticing him humming, small tunes he once played on the piano, the same old upright now moved into my own home. One rainy afternoon, he said, "Jennifer, I think I'd like to write a new will." "You already did," I reminded him gently. "No, not the legal kind," he said, tapping his temple. "The kind that speaks for my heart." He spent the evening dictating letters, one to Brian, one to me, and one to the local paper, correcting the public narrative about his decline. He ended it with, "To age with dignity is a right, not a courtesy granted by the younger generation." I was not confused. I was silenced. But thanks to my granddaughter, I speak again. When he signed it, his hand didn't shake. Later that night, over chamomile tea, he looked up and said, "You know, when you were 10, I told you girls didn't belong in combat. That was ignorant. You belong wherever you fight with integrity. I fought for you, Grandpa." He reached across the table, placed his hand over mine. "And I'll spend the rest of my days proud that you did." We didn't talk about my father again, not because we'd forgotten, but because we'd outgrown the need to relive his shadow. Instead, we filled our days with books, quiet music, occasional debates over history, and planning for a legacy that would now outlast both of us. We planted a new apple tree in the backyard. He wanted something to grow after he was gone. As I watched him sip tea and smile under that tree a few weeks later, I realized revenge hadn't brought us here, restoration had. And maybe, in the end, that was the better victory. I stood at the front of the lecture hall, the air still with anticipation. The room wasn't full of strangers, it was full of future leaders. Young cadets in crisp uniforms, some barely out of high school, others with quiet eyes that had already seen too much. They looked at me not as a war hero, nor a fallen daughter, just as someone who had walked through fire and returned with something worth saying. I clicked off the projector. "This isn't about tactics," I said calmly. "It's about conscience." Their faces reflected focus. No slouching, no glancing at watches. They were waiting. And so I gave it to them. Not theory, not sanitized versions. But the moment I stood between my grandfather and a man who used to be my father. I told them about the retirement gala, the too smooth whiskey, the legal papers that smelled like manipulation. The moment I looked into my grandfather's dazed eyes and knew this wasn't aging. This was orchestrated. They leaned forward. I didn't confront him with fists, I continued. I didn't shout. I just whispered, "Grandpa, we're leaving, now." Some of them smiled faintly, but they didn't know the full weight of those words. "He trusted me," I said. Even confused, even frail, he trusted me enough to walk out on everything. And then from the back row, a hand went up. A young woman, sharp jaw, sharper eyes. "Ma'am," she asked, her voice steady, "how do you know when to speak up and when staying silent is stronger?" I paused. The question wasn't academic. It was personal. It always was, underneath the brass and protocol. "I used to think silence meant weakness," I answered. "That if I didn't fight back immediately, I was complicit." But that night, I learned something else. I glanced around the room. When silence lets you shield someone you love, when it buys time, protection, clarity, that silence can be the strongest stand you ever take. They didn't clap. They didn't need to. Their stillness was louder. After the class, a few cadets lingered behind. One of them, a young man with burn scars along his jawline, walked up to me and simply said, "My grandmother raised me. I think I would have failed her if I hadn't heard this today." I didn't cry. I nodded, shook his hand, and whispered, "Then don't fail her. Ever." In the weeks that followed, I built a new rhythm, teaching not just by rank, but by story, not by rules, but by reflection. I shared what it meant to feel helpless and still act, what it meant to love someone enough to not just protect their legacy, but restore it. One afternoon, after a session on the Geneva Conventions, I returned to my office to find a letter from Brian. No apology, but a quiet update. He was volunteering at a legal clinic for elder protection now. He didn't sign it "your brother," just his name, but I understood what that meant. I smiled. Growth doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it shows up in lowercase. That night, as I sat grading papers, Grandpa called. He had forgotten his remote again, wanted me to walk him through it like usual. "Jennifer," he said after I explained the buttons. "You remember when I told you I wished I'd spoken up sooner?" "Yes," I replied. "Well, I realize now that silence gave me you, and you were the voice I didn't know I needed." I leaned back in my chair. Not every battle ends with medals. Some end with a simple sentence, and peace. We sat on the porch of the old house. The sun dipped behind the hills, casting golden streaks across the quiet yard. Grandpa sipped his chamomile tea slowly, hands a little steadier than weeks ago, eyes softer than I'd seen them in years. The wind carried the scent of cut grass and old wood. Familiar, safe. "I didn't think you'd come back," he said quietly, not looking at me. I smiled, taking a sip from my own cup. "I didn't think I would either." He nodded once, then turned to me. "You didn't have to come back for me, Jenny. I never expected you to fix what others broke." I leaned back in the creaky rocking chair, letting his words settle. "No," I replied, voice calm, certain. "I didn't come back for you." He blinked, surprised. "I came back for the part of myself that still believed this house could be a home, and that some battles are worth stepping off base for." We didn't say anything for a long while after that. The silence wasn't empty, it was earned. Behind us, the house was no longer hollow with manipulation. I had restored the title, hired a new nurse who didn't flinch when Grandpa forgot names, and worked with a notary to build a legal structure that protected him from anyone who might ever try again. But beyond the paperwork, beyond the victory, this, right here, was what I fought for. A quiet porch, an honest moment, no medals, no uniforms, just two people, blood-bound, trying to begin again. As the sun sank lower, Grandpa turned to me with eyes that glistened a little more than usual. "I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner, about your father, about everything." I reached out and placed my hand over his. "You gave me music when no one else listened. You taught me to trust my own rhythm. That was enough." He let out a small breath. "You always did have your own tempo," I laughed gently. "Still do." We sat there as the last of the sunlight filtered through the trees. A kind of peace settled in my chest I hadn't felt in years. Not because everything was perfect, but because I'd chosen to protect something that mattered. And then softly, almost to himself, Grandpa said, "I'm proud of you, Jennifer, not for what you did, but for who you chose to be." I closed my eyes for a second, letting those words wash over me like a balm. The screen door creaked behind us as the nurse brought out a folded blanket. Grandpa waved her off with a grin. "We're fine, just watching the world get quiet." I looked over at him, a man once almost erased by greed, now sitting steady beside me, alive, whole, and seen. And I thought, this is the real revenge. Not rage, not exposure, but protection, restoration, peace. As the sky turned lavender, I knew we wouldn't stay on that porch forever. Life would move again. Cases, cadets, conversations. But I would carry this moment with me, because I hadn't destroyed anyone. I had simply refused to let them destroy what was still good. And before we say goodbye, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee? Or a late night where stories like this keep you company? Let me know in the comments. I read everyone with gratitude. And if this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel. Not just to hear more stories like this, but to be part of a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Wherever you are, I hope you carry this story with you, and remember, sometimes the miracle doesn't knock on your door. It waits quietly until you're ready to open your heart. Take care, and we'll see you in the next story.